Welcome to the Skeptic's Guide to Investing with Steve Davenport and Clem Miller. Every 2 weeks, Steve and Clem bring you brief investment insights you may not find anywhere else. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Here are Steve and Clem.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Skeptic's Guide to Investing. I'm Steve Davenport, and I'm here with Clem Miller, and we are going to talk to you today about the issue that doesn't seem to go away, Ukraine and the EU and Russia. How does this all affect the U.S. economy, the military sections of our industrial sector, and is this an opportunity for weapons, or is this something that is going to go away soon? And by the time you get into the military stocks, they will probably have gone down because Trump will have negotiated a new peace. I'm not sure that anybody expected on the first day, as Trump promised, he would call Putin and they would have a conversation and the Ukraine battles would end. It hasn't happened. It doesn't look to happen because Trump is now stepping away from the peacekeeper role, and the Pope, or Turkey's Erdogan, are stepping into that void and trying to figure out a way to stop what is the most violence in Europe that we've seen many years. So I guess I have to ask you, Clem, is this war, which was supposed to be over on Inauguration Day, going to see the next inauguration, or do you think we'll see something that will bring it to the peace table and allow us to say that there is peace in Europe again?
So if you look at World War II, from 1939 to 1945, World War II in Europe, that is, it was a 6-year war. So we are now halfway towards that 6-year period. So I think that, and Putin and the Russians, they tend to look sort of long term. They don't look at this as, oh, well, we failed to go in for 3 days. We failed to take Kyiv in 3 days, therefore we're going to end the war. They don't think of it that way. They think in terms of long-term strategic objectives. And so my guess is that this thing is about half over at this point. That would be my guess. And I think that what we're seeing is, you got to look at Ukraine as not just a contained issue. I think you need to look at Ukraine as part of a bigger puzzle, which includes activities that Russia is engaging in against other European countries. So, for example, beefing up forces along other parts of the border, especially with Finland recently. Also, being a little bit more aggressive in the Baltic Sea. And in addition to that, doing things like cutting telecommunications cables that go from Western Europe up to Scandinavia. So I think there's a bit, and some cyber activity. So I think this is part of an overall aggression aimed at trying to weaken Europe, and to some degree weaken the United States as well. And I think the Russians, Putin is counting on Trump's impatience to try to either put him to the wayside so that he's irrelevant to this equation, or bring Trump on their side. And I don't think the Russians are quite succeeding in that. I mean, they're trying to exploit the fact that Trump says he wants peace in Ukraine. So they're trying to exploit that. But at the end of the day, I think the Russians are not going to do things that actually, bring a permanent peace to Europe.
Doesn't it feel though that if the Europeans can have to deal with Russia on their own without US heavy involvement, both from financially and from resources, that Putin has won because he knows how to distract and approach Europe because he knows that they've been mainly a pacifist consumer of his energy. And if he can just take away the US's involvement, if the US hadn't been involved for the last 3 years, where would we be in Ukraine today? I think it would have been over.
I agree with that.
So
I agree with that.
I guess I'm saying that if Trump is becoming neutral, then that's a very pro-Putin move. And so even though it allows him to not do anything and then say, hey, I tried to make a peace, but nobody would make the peace, and therefore it's the blood is not on my hands.
Yeah. U.S. neutrality plays into Putin's hands. And the main reason it plays into Putin's hands is because the U.S. is likely to start moving away from sanctions. And
Yeah.
it's U.S. and European sanctions that have really hurt Russia. And Putin is playing into Trump's, deal making kind of philosophy. The Russians have sort of dangled energy resources and other things in front of Trump, and so Trump, wants to try to, get access to those, and Putin is using that to sort of push the U.S. into a neutral position. But I'd also say another thing too: the Ukraine we see today is not the same Ukraine that we saw in 2022, and certainly not the same Ukraine we saw in 2014 before Crimea. All throughout this time, Ukraine has been getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and developing its military and expanding it, and bringing it up to speed technologically, and doing a lot of homegrown military issues, military equipment, namely drones, for example, and also adopting new military tactics. Ukraine is going to end up with the most powerful, I believe, outside of certain areas of technology. I think Ukraine is going to end up having the most powerful army in Europe at some point,
Wow.
if it doesn't already. And that's why I sometimes tell people, and I'll say it again here, that I think the EU needs Ukraine just as much as Ukraine needs the EU, because even Zelensky has said that once we're in NATO, this is Zelensky and his desire to become part of NATO. Once we're in NATO, we Ukraine are going to make one of the biggest contributions to the NATO alliance because of their frontline status and huge army. I mean, NATO is a very different place. European NATO, that is in a very different position than it was 5 years ago. You've got Ukraine's army, you've got Poland's big army, you've got Finland and its big army now in NATO. It's the Eastern Front is very militarized right now. The Eastern Front of NATO is very militarized right now. And
Is this a short-term reaction or is this a long-term trend? That's what I have a problem with military stocks and this whole discussion about military usage and as an investment.
okay,
Is it a short-term opportunity or is it a theme that you could invest in over years? Because it feels to me like Europe had a movement towards ESG and environment, and they focused their energy in the economies and the environment. And now all of a sudden, Merz has turned the corner and said, we're going to make the budget and allow for the debt to move up because we are going to commit, 5% to the military. And I just don't, it's hard for me to determine, is this a short-term reaction that could turn just as quickly the other way if there were a peace in the Ukraine? But if we don't believe that peace is really able to be maintained, then we will constantly see the demand for military weapons, and therefore it's a better investment theme. I hate to break it down to investments when we're talking about the lives of Ukrainians and Russians, but I think that's what's been a struggle for me going forward is how heavily do you want to invest in military? And is it really a long-term theme? We've had peace for so long, relatively speaking, around the world, that to think that we're going to move into a military age feels a little bit less likely. Do you agree?
Um, I think we are going into a military age, and so let me give you a few reasons for that. One is I do think, to your point about the EU sort of switching gears from sort of an ESG orientation to a military orientation. I think the EU folks think they can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Oh, that's
And
ridiculous.
and no, and in fact, I think that one of the reasons why the EU has been trying to promote green energy and natural and green energy, wind, solar, uh, is because they were dependent on Russian natural gas. And so I think, and they've built some facilities to take U.S. natural gas as well. So I think that reducing a dependency on your enemy is something they thought was a good thing, and the ESG, you know, um, green energy uh, allows them as one part of their strategy to deal with that. So I don't think those two things are inconsistent. I really don't. So I think that in terms of
Well, if they wanted to be more independent, and that was the reason, then
yeah,
wouldn't you have kept nuclear? Because it feels like if you what you're saying is true, they wanted to separate themselves from Russia. The fastest way is to develop nuclear, not to develop solar, right?
well, yeah,
That technology already exists, and you're just
yeah, you
and
would think, you
so
would
when
think,
you can't really, I don't know, I look at nuclear and I think that has to be part of your plan.
right?
If it,
It
and
should be, and it still is very much a part of the French plan. The French have never gotten rid of nuclear, but Germany, I don't know how far they have denuclearized, but you got to remember Fukushima was 2011, and that's what started the German denuclearization, and that's 14 years ago. And so they probably made already some progress on that. And they did this before 2014, the Crimean invasion. They certainly did it before 2022. So they probably made some progress already toward denuclearization. But still, I think that this emphasis on green energy is connected to this plan for trying to become less dependent on Russian natural gas. That's not to say they're not dependent on natural gas. They're getting natural gas from North Africa, for example. They're getting LNG from Qatar. They're getting LNG from the United States.
I saw
So
somewhere where Europe was still getting natural gas from Russia.
they have a little bit coming in from the south, not from Nord Stream, of course, which was blown up,
Right.
but from the south versus I believe something called Turk Stream, um, but through the south.
Or is it
And
another country and Russia supplies that country? Is that the
well,
deal?
it's this 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 relates to the fact that Hungary and Slovakia, I believe, are still getting natural gas from Russia
Oh,
versus this southern pipeline.
okay. It feels like the U.S. is trying. I mean, there's a bill in the Senate with 80 co-authors who wants to increase the tariffs on Russia to 500% and harden the economic damage to Putin. And if that bill were to ever get brought up, I think it would get passed, and it would get passed to the House, and the House has a majority to pass it and put it on Trump's desk. Do you think that's where we're going? Is it when he starts focusing on these tariffs for Europe as a trading partner and starts to look at what's our common enemy, that will start to, I mean, do we have the bandwidth in Congress to walk and chew gum and do a tax bill and a bill on international affairs? Or do we have to pass one before we can move on to the other?
Well, you could put one inside the other, for example, or you could do them in parallel. But you know,
it is in the big beautiful bill already. The big beautiful bill, and if you can't change.
Well, you'd have to go back to the House and get some changes to it. No, I think it's more likely it would be a separate bill. But the problem is with that is we already have, and so does the EU. We already have very extensive sanctions on Russia. And tariffs.
But are they being enforced?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And tariffs are just a ridiculous concept when it comes to Russia because they don't export anything to us. So it's just it's the idea. I know Trump likes to think of tariffs as being the solution to everything, but tariffs, they're irrelevant when it comes to Russia. I mean, the fact that he might be talking about tariffs with regard to Russia, to me suggests possibly that he's just trying to, he's being, subtly pro-Putin by actually recommending something that actually has no impact on Putin.
I could see that.
Yeah.
But
so
I guess I'm saying is
it's sanctions that really matter. The two things that really, three things. There's three things that could really hurt Russia. One is giving more and more weapons and more advanced weapons to Ukraine. That's second. That's number one. Number two is allowing Russia's seized foreign assets, Western seized foreign assets, to be used to pay for weapons. And there's a lot of those assets right now. The West is allowing the interest earned on those assets to be used by Ukraine. But if we were to actually allow the bulk, the corpus, so to speak, of those assets to be used, that would be a huge thing. And the other thing, the last thing, would be to really crack down on this so-called shadow fleet that Russia's using to secretly export oil. And
Right.
if we really crack down on that, that would be.
That's what I meant when I said that we need to crack down, because everybody knows there's this additional fleet of oil moving around that is not being captured by these sanctions. So,
but can I take you back to the U.S. for example?
So, yeah, tell me why when we're going to see this bill pass and it's going to make an impact on what's happening in Russia. Do you think there's courage in the Republican side to actually do something on their own without the leadership of Trump?
We'll be right back.
We hope you're enjoying our episodes. If you are, then we'd greatly appreciate your liking, following, and sharing. Help us help others. Now let's get back to the discussion.
I mean, he still has to sign the bill or get a
Right.
super majority. So I don't think anything's going to happen on Russia unless, from the U.S. standpoint, unless the Trump administration is convinced to do it. So I don't think that's the case. But let me just dive into that a little bit more. there, there's the there, there's the types. So if you look at U.S. Arms sales to Europe, or U.S. arms deliveries and U.S. arms sales to Ukraine and also to the rest of Europe, there's really three types. One are ones where we're actually financing the arms sales. The U.S. government is financing the arms sales. The second is where the U.S. government is giving away or financing on very, very inexpensive, cheap financing terms, unused stocks that we have that haven't been used. In other words, surplus, right? Military surplus. And the third type would be sort of ongoing sales that aren't financed by the U.S. government. So my guess is that we're going to see much less of the first kind. In other words, I think that U.S. financing of arms sales to Ukraine might diminish a lot.
So does it get replaced by European arms dealers?
Well, it would be no. I think what's going to happen is the U.S. is going to say to our defense companies, we're not going to pay for it anymore. So you have to make commercial deals with Ukraine, and Ukraine's going to have to come up with the money, probably through these seized foreign assets, in order to pay, or the Europeans would have to pay for it, and they would pay for commercial weapon sales from the U.S. To fit gaps which exist within the European.
Wouldn't they want to use European companies if they're going to have to pay? Wouldn't it be better to pay?
Well, I mean, there are certain things that Europe has that the U.S. has, and there are certain things that Europe doesn't have that the U.S. has. And just one example for that would be Patriot, defense system. Europe doesn't really have something of that capability, and
that's one question. I have two or three questions that I just need a yes or no answer. Will Germany?
There's never a yes or no for me.
Yes, there has to be. We can't have these podcasts go on forever. There needs to be some yes or no's. So first, yes or no. Germany will release and deliver the Taurus missile to the Ukraine.
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
The U.S. will pass the bill in the House and Senate to increase sanctions against Russia. Yes or no?
Yes.
Trump will sign said bill to deliver sanctions against Russia. Yes or no?
I don't think so.
Okay, and
well, it depends on what's in the sanctions bill.
Well, it's going to be.
The reason I think Trump may not sign it is that Trump sees dollar signs, and he doesn't want to be. He may not lift existing sanctions, but he wants to leave open the possibility that he could make for the U.S. and perhaps for himself money in Russia.
Okay, well,
he's, regardless of what people may think about whether Trump is in Putin's pocket, and it's kind of hard to know whether that's the case or not. He's been very interested in Russia since it was the Soviet Union, going over there, trying to build a Trump Tower, and that's all public record, and so he's been very interested in doing business in Russia, and I don't think that's gone away.
It seems to me that the biggest opportunity for the U.S. in the next, when I look at the energy space, is to become the natural gas supplier to Germany from the East Coast ports of LNG and from the West Coast ports to Japan with LNG. If we became an LNG power, wouldn't there be two huge allies who would start to be dependent upon us for their energy supplies? And aren't we a better supplier in terms of stability than what they're doing with Russia? It feels like everybody talks about the US making more money and the US having more, Trump wanting to have more consumption of the US products. And we have this natural gas that we're just burning off into the environment here in the US. Why wouldn't we take that energy and put it to those two allies and say, we want to have a long-term, trade imbalance adjusted, and we're going to do it with LNG. And that solves a lot of the questions about our imports and our exports, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly adds to exports and reduces overall trade deficits.
Right.
But the crazy thing, one of the crazy things about the Trump administration's tariffs is that he always looks at it on a bilateral basis and not on a multilateral basis. There was this so-called temporary deal with the UK, and the UK has a trade US has a trade surplus with the UK, and yet we're still putting 10% tariffs on them. Go figure, right?
Yeah, I could figure out. It's just you figure out where politically it's popular, and then you go for that. Do you think any of these decisions by the Trump administration have not been polled across their voter base in those states? I mean, everything is now polled before it is decided, isn't it?
I don't think so. I think Trump is pulling a lot of this crap out of his brain. Okay. I think that's what's going on. Okay. And he's got, the old imagery of the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. So
Sure.
he's got on one shoulder, he's got Peter Navarro. And then on the other shoulder, he's got Scott Bessent. Scott Bessent's the angel. Peter Navarro's the devil. And then you've got, the local joker who is Howard Lutnick. Okay, sort of running around.
And Rubio?
Rubio is...
I think Rubio's with Bessent.
I agree with that.
Okay, and Lutnick, I agree, would go on the devil's shoulder. But
Navarro and
Lutnick.
And Lutnick, yeah. And so it all, like they say, it all depends on who's whispered in Trump's ear last. And if Navarro is that person, then Trump is going to keep doing these crazy things. If it's Scott Bessent, he's going to be more reasonable.
Okay, from an investment standpoint, if you had a young person who was asking you what to buy in this chaos that is the markets right now, and I'd use the term chaos a little bit loosely because it's been all good for the last month after kind of a bad April. But let's look at, the question about, would you invest in U.S. arms, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, RTX now, yes or no?
Yes or no?
Yes or no? We got to get some yes or no's in there. You can ask me a yes or no.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You think so?
Yeah, I would.
So this is not a short-term investment. This is something you can hold for a while because this
I would say it's actually more long-term than short-term.
Okay.
Because I think there's a lot of volatility, in terms of, the Trump administration could say, okay, we're going to reduce our arms sales, and then it's over, right, for these companies.
Well, if they're looking to export, what do you have in the U.S. that we're leaders in? You have technology, you have some arms, you have energy, you have consumer companies, you have media. I'd say that we're probably
a lot of it's services, and it doesn't even go into the trade deficit calculation.
I know that the calculation is wrong, and I know that, but I guess I point to things that people can put their hands on, understanding why I invest in this, because I see demand coming for years and years for this part of the world who will continue to need the U.S. as a supplier. And that's where
I think long-term defense is an area to go to.
Okay.
And I think you need to look at uh I think you need to look at companies that have defense companies that have a broader array of programs. So like
Okay.
RTX, which combined Raytheon and United Technologies, I think I mean, I don't want to I'm not going to recommend a stock on this call, but I think, you want something like an RTX, which is more diversified in terms of its military product offering. But again, this is a long-term thing. There's going to be a lot of short-term volatility because depending on what the current geopolitical winds are. And I wouldn't assume these geopolitical winds are you know are sort of stable in one direction. I think they can move
No,
around and
I think this is, to me, this is one of those areas that is very hard to pick. And if you agree it is a longer term, then I think, I saw Europe as not moving in this direction. So I was surprised by Mertz and the current
right.
European actions.
Right.
So
So I think
I
maybe
think,
European companies would be good. And also, back to my prior point, if you're going to pick, I think you would have to do some research into those defense stocks that are less reliant on government financing and are more able to make commercial sales. So I would look at that.
sure. I mean, I think that brings us to the Middle East and some other things, and especially Taiwan. So let's just try to wrap one more topic into this Ukraine question, because the first thing that Trump did and tried to do, or is trying to do with Ukraine, was the concept of signing a rare earth agreement to have the U.S. be one of the firms or countries that does most of the rare earth work in the Ukraine. And the rare earth capacity or ability in the Ukraine seems to be a very large reason for the US to be involved. I guess, is it really a good move for us to be looking at rare earth from the Ukraine, which is between Europe and Russia, versus looking at rare earths from Canada, which is right across our border and a lot closer in this hemisphere? It feels to me like signing a bill in the Ukraine is like signing a bill in Gaza and saying, I want to build condos on the water. It's like you're going to have to really deal with a lot of effort to create rare earth industries in the Ukraine, whereas Canada, which has, worked hard to produce energy and does a lot in the smelting and aluminum space, would seem like a much more likely partner for us to pair up with. Why are we chasing rare earths in the Ukraine? Is it just a reason for Trump to sign a bill and say, hey, this is another win for the US? Couldn't we find an easier partner?
So China is not an easy partner when it comes to rare earths.
Correct. We're looking for a substitute for China.
Right.
But my question is, wouldn't it just be easier to reach across and talk to Canada about
Right.
rare earths and to go all the way to Ukraine?
Here's the thing that we need to understand about rare earths that I think very few people really grasp, or few people, I should say, really grasp. Rare earths are not uncommon. There's a lot of rare earths in the United States, in other countries. The reason why China produces a lot of rare earths is because they're willing to put in the extremely environmentally unfriendly facilities that are needed in order to produce rare earths, in order to refine them. And Canada, you know, they might be willing to do it because, after all, they're willing to do the tar sands, right, in Alberta.
Well,
So
to do the smelting for the aluminum.
yeah, so they might be willing to do it, but it all depends on finding countries that are, in that are willing to take or absorb some of the environmental damage from from processing the rare earths. And that the reason why China produces so much rare earths is because they don't really care about the environment too much, or they didn't actually at the time when they put in this rare earths processing capacity.
Is Russia's engagement in the Ukraine not really about history and about something like rare earths and the wheat basket that is the Ukraine in terms of resources for the rest of Russia? Or is it really based on this 6,900-page diatribe that Putin went on about how important Kiev is to the history of Russia?
Well, it's both. So the Donbass region is really the most resource intensive or mineral intensive region of Ukraine. So that's why, in part, why that was a focus, and a lot of Russian speakers in the Donbass. So that's why there was a particular focus there, and on Crimea, which also has a lot of Russian speakers, and at various points has been a part of the it was part of the Russian SFSR, the Russian part of the Soviet Union for a long time until Khrushchev gave it to the Ukrainian part of the USSR. But I also think that the whole, question of origins plays a role too, in the sense that long before there was a Moscow, um, which, by the way, was founded by, or at least in part by Swedes coming down from, they were called the Varangians, the Swedes who came down to help found Moscow. Long before that, there was Kiev, which was the heart of the Eastern Slavs at the time, and also of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And Kiev split off into three different groups, ethnic groups, with somewhat different languages. The Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Belarusians. And those three constitute, if you look at it from a linguistic standpoint, that's the East Slavic language group, those three countries, those three languages, and they split off into different languages and then ultimately into different countries. But, essentially from Putin's standpoint, he wants to control, all of the Eastern Slavic region. So he already controls sort of indirectly Belarus. He wants to control Ukraine. And by doing that, he would then control all of the Eastern Slavic domains. Now, the question is whether he wants to go even further and control, the Western Slavic domains, which are Poland and Czech and Slovakia, and then, control the Baltics, which obviously are very close and have languages that are much more distantly related, but still kind of related to the Slavic languages.
Yeah, it's hard for me to see this as that historical reunification that he believes is important. I come down to economics and dollars and cents, and it feels to me like Putin wants that area for its resources, and that those resources is what Trump is trying to put in, some administration of, because then if the U.S. is developing those assets, then it would be impossible for it to happen in a conflicted area like they're still fighting in those areas. There needs to be peace in order for those industries to succeed.
I think Trump.
It's not a bad theory, but I'm not sure the application is entirely feasible.
It's not. It's not.
Should we buy rare earth companies that are going to start in the Ukraine? Is that the investment thesis for us in 2025?
Look. I would draw an analogy to the fact that you had so much Western investment in Siberia, in Sakhalin Island, in Russia, and all of that had to be walked away from by Western energy companies because of sanctions and reputational issues having to do with the Russian invasion. So just because, the fact that there was all this Western investment in Russia did not dissuade Putin from invading. He may have thought that the Western energy companies would side with him, for commercial reasons, but ultimately they didn't. So I don't think resources, yeah, they play a role, but resources are not determinative of whether you have conflict or not.
Okay. If,
That's
if,
my
if,
perspective on that.
Yeah, it just feels a little bit like I see what's happening in Gaza, I see what's happening in Taiwan, and I see what's happening in the Ukraine. And all three have this underlying, we need to write this for our country and our national history and these areas and territories are important to us. Whether we're talking about Taiwan's island or whether we're talking about the religious significance of Jerusalem, there is this historic kind of discussion. And I've always thought that history and economics, are kind of, one leads, the economics usually in my mind lead the history. And it's not usually in people's best interest to go after something because of some historical concept, unless there's an economic benefit. Isn't that usually how, if countries need resources, countries act in aggressive ways to achieve it? It's not like they say, hey, I think I want to reunite with Kiev because historically it's got a lot of significance. And we'll just do this as an exercise to right historical wrongs. Am I being naive to think economically? And I need to go back and read my history books?
I think, from a U.S. perspective, we don't see history the same way that people in other countries do. People in other countries have a much longer perspective on history.
Well, yeah, we're a newcomer with only 200
Yeah,
years. I mean,
and
so
and Latin America is a newcomer too. I think that we have to understand that Russia takes a very long view on things, and so do other European countries. Our allies in Europe take a very long-term view of things, and some of the Asian countries, despite colonialism, they have much longer histories than that, and they take a long-term view of things. So, yeah, I mean, I think history can be an excuse for the pursuit of economic ends, but history also stands on its own as well. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that. Um, and then there are sort of conflicting historical narratives as well.
right. We just talked about Leif Erikson discovering America long before
Yeah,
the Pilgrims, right?
yeah.
So I guess I'd like to wrap up today's call with just one kind of theme, which is, do we think there are investment opportunities in the actions of Ukraine? And if so, what would you invest in to take advantage of it?
So I would look long term at defense companies that have a more commercial orientation and are not entirely dependent on U.S. military contracts. So I would take a look at that. We talked about rare earths. Uh, I think it's going to be a long time before rare earths are exploited in the Ukraine to any big degree. But I think that rare earths and lithium, copper, I think offer a lot of opportunities elsewhere in the world. Canada, the Andean countries offer a lot of this as well. Australia, but I wouldn't count on Ukraine, and I wouldn't count on China.
Okay. I think for this call, and you can write down this date, I'm going to agree with everything you said, Clem.
Okay.
So I don't have any. I think there are opportunities in defense, and I like to see them be broad-based. I would probably limit myself to U.S.-based military corporations because I think there's a lot of politicization of these, and I think it's going to be helpful to have companies that are based in the United States because I think our use of and our demand for weapons is going to continue to grow. So I believe that U.S. companies are a good place to play that, and I do think it's a longer term trend. I agree with the investment in raw materials, the Rio Tintos, the Newmont, those companies to me are always given the low interest compared to the excitement of AI, but they produce a lot of dividends. They produce a lot of materials that are critical to our overall economic success. So I would agree that although they're boring and although they're basic materials, they're still pretty important materials. And I think it's an area that everybody should make part of their portfolio. If you're building a portfolio for the future, you have to think about the building in copper and steel as important elements of every economy and infrastructure. So anything else to add today, Clem, as we head off?
No, I think that's it. It was a great conversation, Steve.
And I'll tell everybody that I think that Clem's taking a trip up to Newfoundland. He may come back a different man. He may start to wear a hat with horns on it, and he could start to look a lot more Nordic on these calls. So I'm looking forward. I hope you have fun, and I think that everybody would love to have your support and continue to call us, continue to text us, continue to let us know which of the podcasts you liked and why, and what we can do to try to deliver and make investing IQ improve for everyone out there. So thanks all the skeptics, and we look forward to getting together again soon. We've got some great guests coming up, Rich Weiss and Marcus Sturdivant. So thanks everyone, and we appreciate you listening.
The views shared on this podcast represent the personal investment views of the hosts. They are for educational purposes and not meant to be taken as investment advice. Listeners should consult their own investment, legal, and tax advisors. Past performance of any investments is not a guarantee for future return.